going to pass away, and of course I'm talking about Sarah. And so let's go ahead and let's read the first 9 verses of Genesis chapter 23 that talk about Sarah's passing. Genesis 23 verses 1 through 9. And Sarah lived 127 years, and these were the years of the life of Sarah. And Sarah died at Kiriath Arba, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. And Abraham went in to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. And Abraham rose up before his dead, and he said to the Hittites, I am a sojourner and a foreigner among you. Give me property among you for a burying place, so that I may bury my dead out of my sight. And the Hittites answered Abraham, Hear us, my lord, you are a prince of God among us. Bury your dead in the choicest of our tombs. None of us will withhold from you his tomb to hinder you from burying your dead. Abraham rose and bowed to the Hittites, the people of the land, and he said to them, If you are willing that I should bury my dead out of sight, hear me and entreat me, Ephron, the son of Zohar, that he may give to me the cave of Machpelah, which he owns at the end of his field, for the full price, and let him give it to me in your presence as property for a burying place. And so here we see that Sarah, the beloved wife of Abraham, dies at 127 years old. And if you look on the PowerPoint, you'll see only time there in parentheses, and that is because why? Why is this unique? What's that? She's female. What about her being female? All right, this is the only time in the Bible where a female's age is given at death. And so this is the only time it takes place here in Genesis chapter 23. So Brother Ed and Sister Sarah, you're both right on that. So the only time this takes place for a female, it's a common thing for men in Genesis, and even when we're talking about the kings and rulers that take place, like in 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st Samuel, but the only time it takes place in the Bible for a female is, of course, Sarah here in Genesis 23. And so she dies at Hebron, and Abraham mourns for his wife. In the ancient Near East, oftentimes mourning would look like a portion or variety of these things: fasting, tearing one's garments, shaving one's hair or beard, and if not shaving it off completely, like cutting it so you could tell that it was disfigured, throwing dirt on your head, or sitting in ash. We can see that all of these take place by individuals throughout the Old Testament, but here it just says that Abraham mourned. So he probably did 1 or 2 of these things, if not all 3. All of those. But Abraham is done mourning, and he wants to bury Sarah, and he's got to find a place to bury her. But there's a problem. Most of the time, you would bury your family in your ancestral homeland. And so oftentimes you would take their body back to where you were from and bury them. There's a problem. Where was Abraham from originally? Right, of the Chaldeans, which is, if it's in southern Sumeria, which is where we think it is, that's a couple of thousand miles away. I mean, it's a long place. If he goes back to where he was called back in Haran, which is where we're going to see here in the next chapter, it's about 450 miles. So it's a long place. But there's also a very important symbolism that takes place. Abraham tells the Hittites that he wants to bury Sarah there, where he's living there in Hebron. And so he tries to find a place where he wants to bury her, and he wants to bury her in the cave of Machpelah that is owned by Hittites. And the Hittites say, Abraham, you don't have to buy the cave. We'll give you any cave that you want to bury Sarah in. It'll be fine. Now, the problem is, are they giving this to Abraham for him to own himself? No, they're not. They're saying, Abraham, you can borrow a tomb from us, because oftentimes in the ancient world, what would happen is you would go to a cave, you would take your dead relative's bones, you would put them in that cave, you would let them decompose for 1 to 2 years, and then when there was nothing left with the bones, you would take the bones and put them in the back of the cave in kind of a heap, if there was more than one person that have used that cave. Or if you wanted to, you would make a box called an ossuary box that the bones would be put into, and then placed in the cave or taken somewhere else. But the cave was seen as a place for the body to decompose. Does that make sense? And so they're saying, Abraham, you can use our cave. They're not saying you can have this cave for yourself and your descendants. They're saying, if you need her body to decompose out of your sight, you can use one of our caves. That'd be fine. Because they're thinking he's going to need it for maybe a year, maybe 2. But Abraham's not interested in that. He's interested in buying this cave. And so he says, no, I want to buy it for the full price. And if we go on and we read the rest of Genesis chapter 23, we see that they're going to be a bargain match, if you will, with Ephron, the one who owns the cave. And he's going to say, Lord, let me give it to you. Now, on first glance to an English reader, it makes it seem like he's saying, I'm going to give it to you at no charge. That's not what Ephraim's saying. This is the beginning of an ancient Near Eastern haggle process. We talked about this before with what two towns? With Abraham haggling with God. Sodom and Gomorrah, right? We see this haggle process take place. It's the foundation of commerce in the ancient Near East in Abraham's day. And so you see the Hittite start to haggle. Let me give it to you for a good price, right? One time, Brittany and I was on our honeymoon, and we went on a cruise ship. We went to a port of call. I think it was in Playa del Carmen, I believe. And we get off the boat, and there's this man who's got hats, straw hats. And I'm walking by, and he goes, free, almost free, right? Did you get that? And I said, I don't think your English is as good as you think it is. Like, that's not what that means, right? He was saying $20, almost free. It's like, it's not almost free, right? But he was trying to get your attention so you could purchase his straw hat. That's kind of what's taking place here between Abraham and Ephraim. Does Abraham want to haggle the price down to where it's a good price? What does Abraham say? If you've read ahead, or maybe you can glance down, what does he say? I want the full price, right? And the words he uses are found in ancient Near Eastern contracts to mean the full price. Because if Abraham would have gotten this down to a small price, and then Ephraim would have died, his sons could have tried to repossess the land, and saying that Abraham had not paid the full price, but had rented it or something like that. So Abraham says, no, in the presence of everybody here, right? In the presence of all the leaders of the Hittites, I'm going to pay the full price for this land. And it's also very strong symbolism by the fact that Abraham is saying, this is where my people are going to stay. That I came here because God told me that my descendants were going to have a stake here in this land for generations upon generations. And with Abraham buying this cave, this is the only tract of land that Abraham will buy his entire life. I mean, he's acquired some wells from Abimelech, but he has no land. He doesn't own any land at all. This is the only thing Abraham will ever buy as far as land, and it's a tomb, basically. But what he's saying is that this is going to become the ancestral lands of my people. We ain't going anywhere. We may have just got here, but we're not going anywhere. We're going to stay here for the long haul. This is very important because who's reading Genesis the first time it's written? Who's writing Genesis? Moses. Who's Moses writing it for? The children of Israel, right? What is Moses, through inspiration, trying to show the children of Israel? Yeah, this is your land, right? We're going to go on this. We're going to go and take this land of Canaan, and it's yours. It's yours because God promised it to Abraham. It's yours because Abraham bought the cave of Machpelah. This is where your patriarchs, your ancestors are buried. This is your rightful land. And so when we go into the Canaan, you're going to fight. You're going to fight boldly because this is your stuff. And so this is very strong symbolism that Abraham does. How much does Abraham pay for this cave? How much? Right, 400 shekels. The average pay for an average laborer or artisan in this time frame is 10 shekels a year. All right, now I'm on math majors out there. How many years worth of labor is this for the average person? 40. And so if you take the average pay of the average American according to the 2018 U.S. Census, which is like $31,000, and you times it by 40 years, it comes around $1.5 million, today's money. So Abraham pays for a tomb to bury his wife. Abraham's a rich guy. Like, that can't be understated how rich Abraham. You're going to see how rich Abraham is in the next chapter also. But this is very important to him. And it's not just because he's looking for a place to bury his wife, but he is staking his claim as a foreigner in this land that this is where my people are going to reside. This is a very important thing for Abraham because he's fulfilling that covenant. He sees this as him fulfilling a part of that covenant that this place is going to be an inheritance for his family for generations upon generations. The tomb is in Mamre. It's about 2 miles north of Hebron. Hebron's an important site for the Israelites. This is going to be where David is going to be anointed as king of Israel. This is also going to be where he's going to reign for the first 7 years of his reign. After that, he'll go and conquer Jerusalem from the Jebusites, and he'll move his capital to Jerusalem. But this is a very important place, Hebron is, for the Israelites. As I mentioned before, it's the first place that David reigns for 7 years. Also, multiple generations are going to be buried in the cave of Machpelah. And they're going to use this as a place of burial for Abraham and also for Isaac. And I'm not sure anybody else, but I know those three. This is the traditional site. If you can see here on this map, you can see where Hebron is. If you can't see that, the very last red dot on that brown trail is Beersheba. The next red dot up from Beersheba is Hebron. And so this is where the cave of Machpelah is, right there, in between Salem and Beersheba. Now, what is Salem going to become later on? Jerusalem, right? And so it's right in between Jerusalem and Beersheba. Beersheba being kind of the southern border of the land of Israel. And so this is an ossuary box from the ancient world. And so as you can see, as the bones decayed and there was nothing left but the bones, they would take the bones and place them into a wooden or a stone box. It's very common. Even the days of Jesus, you can go and you can see ossuary boxes, both Christian, Jewish, even Roman ossuary boxes are all over museums in Europe. So it's a very, very common thing. Here is the Temple of the Patriarchs. This was built in about 1000 AD, I believe. It was built by Christians during the time of the Crusades. It was then taken over by the Muslims and made into a mosque. The Christians then took it back over. Then it was taken back over by the Muslims. And then in 1967, this was part of the land that the nation of Israel won, if you will, during that war in the late 60s. And so what they did, they took it and they divided it in half. And so today, you can go there in Palestine. Half of it is a Jewish temple. The other half is a Muslim mosque. And so you can still go to the Temple of the Patriarchs today. This is a traditional site of where Abraham, Sarah, and Isaac were buried. Do we know if it is or not? No idea. But one of the interesting things, one of the first things built here at this site is in the days of Jesus. And so it goes all the way back to Herod the Great. So even 2,000 years ago, this was still the traditional site of where they believed that Abraham and Sarah were buried. Now, if this was built during the days of Jesus, how many years had it been since the death of Abraham and Sarah? Somebody said, a little bit more, 1,500. Miss Julie, did you say it? What was that? 2,000? Yeah, absolutely. Miss Luana said it. 2,000 years, roughly. And so that's the same amount of time as us to Jesus. So even though 2,000 years ago, Herod and the first century Jews thought this is where they were buried, we also have to remember, they were 2,000 years removed also. So it's a long, long time. But it is kind of neat to think about. And so then we go on to Genesis chapter 24, and we find Abraham, now that Sarah's died, wants to find Isaac a wife, like any good parent does. I was talking to Saha when Saha was here, and I was talking to Randy Whitworth about this morning. When Saha was here, he was asking about Brittany and how Brittany and I met each other and how we were married. And he smiled. And he was basically like, "Yes, I'm arranging a marriage for my daughter right now." It's like, oh, really? Different cultures, right? In India, most people still arrange the marriage of their children. And so he was telling me about the family this boy came from. And it was an interesting conversation, right? About just the differences in culture. But Abraham, his wife has died. He knows that his life is coming to an end at some point. Sarah's 127 when she dies. How old's Abraham? 137, right? He's 10 years older. And so his wife has just died. He's thinking about the brevity of life, the assurance of death. And he's thinking, I need to get Isaac a wife. I need to get him a good wife. And so he's got a desire. We see that take place in verses 1 through 14. And let's go ahead and let's read verses 1 through 9. This is interesting. Genesis 24 is the longest chapter in Genesis. But also, Genesis chapter 24, verses 6 to 8, is the last recorded words of Abraham. And so let's go ahead and let's read what Abraham was on his mind. Now Abraham was old and well advanced in years, and the Lord had blessed Abraham in all things. And Abraham said to his servant, the oldest of his household, who had charge of all that he had, "Put your hand under my thigh, that I may make you swear by the Lord, the God of heaven, the God of earth, that you will not take a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites among whom I dwell. but will go to my country and to my kindred, and take a wife for my son Isaac. And the servant said to him, perhaps the woman will not be willing to follow me to this land. Must I then take your son back to the land from which you came? And Abraham said to him, see to it that you do not take my son back there. The Lord, the God of heaven, who took me from my father's house and from the land of my kindred, who spoke to me, swore to me, to your offspring I will give this land. And he will send his angel before you, and you shall take a wife for my son from there. But if the woman is not willing to follow you, then you will be free from your oath of mine. Only you must not take my son back there. And so the servant put his hand under the thigh of Abraham, and the master swore to him concerning this matter. And so Abraham is trying to set his son up spiritually with a good wife, as all parents should be concerned about with their children, and I'm sure most of us can relate to. But Abraham charges his servant to go and to find a wife for his son Isaac. And what's his stipulation? Where is he not to find a wife from? Canaan, right? He says, you got to go back and you got to get a wife, not only from my hometown, but from where? From my kin, right? You go back, and so he's worried about this is an ethnic charge, not to intermingle with the Canaanite women. Abraham was extremely concerned about the foreign women and the covenantal blessing that God promised being watered down and put in jeopardy by foreign wives. And so God blessed Abraham in this endeavor to find a wife for his son back from his own kindred. And so Esau would disappoint his father Isaac by doing the opposite and marrying Canaanite women. I say women because he married two of them in Genesis 26, verse 35. God would also hold Israel to the same standard when they entered into Canaan, not to marry the Canaanite women, Deuteronomy 7, 3 through 5. But unfortunately, they were not as committed as the patriarchs in seeing this through. And because of this, they were taken off into idolatrous worship. Judges 3, verses 5 through 7 tells us that it was the foreign wives that took them into that idolatrous worship. And so this is about ethnic separation. The Hebrews, eventually they would be known as the Israelites, are to be a distinct ethnic group in the region. And so this is important. Just like we mentioned beforehand, Moses is trying to stress the fact that none of these Canaanite ethnicities, none of these Canaanite nations have a claim to the land in which they live. They're all wicked. They're all idolatrous. They didn't have a divine claim there, and God is ready to drive them out. That's important because Moses, through inspiration, is trying to show the Israelites they are justified in their taking of the land. This is the land that is promised to them, that God was going to give to them, and it's now to them they're going to go back and take it. And just like Abraham didn't want Isaac marrying a Canaanite wife, you're not supposed to do that either. Now, unfortunately, did the Israelites listen? No. Instead of being like Isaac or Jacob, they were like Esau. They saw the Canaanite women and they wanted to marry them, and of course the nation of Israel suffered because of that. Now, was Abraham's family monotheistic? No. How do we know that for certain? How are we not guessing? We know they were when Abraham left, right? How do we know they still were when Isaac is trying to get a wife? I mean, Abraham's been gone for, at this time, almost 75 years. Anybody? Somebody knows it. They're just not saying anything. Don't be shy. I'll give you a hint. It's got nothing to do with Rebecca.
Rachel stole the idols from her dad.
Yeah. Rachel's got a brother. Who's the brother? Laban. Laban's got a daughter whose name is? Right, Leah and Rachel, right? And so when Jacob leaves Laban's house, who's Rebecca's brother, what does she take? And Brother Faust has already told us. She takes the idols, right? The family idols. And so their family are polytheistic. They may worship Yahweh, but that's not the only God they worship. We can see they say Yahweh's name in Genesis 24 when talking about the blessings that Abraham has received. And so maybe they have an idea of who Yahweh is, but it seems like their loyalty is divided up between multiple gods. And so it's not that they were more pious than the Canaanites at this time. It was the fact that God was trying to preserve, and Abraham as well, that ethnic purity, if you will, and not intermingling with the Canaanites. And so the servant goes to Haran to see the town of Nahor. Nahor is also the name of Abraham's brother. And it's about 435 miles. That's a long trip today. That's a long trip on the back of a camel 4,000 years ago. And so it takes a month to get there. And so he meets Rebekah at the well. Here is a map that you can see. I realize it's really hard to see, but if you notice that green line that goes down from like where Beersheba is all the way to the north, that you can see where Haran is, that's the trip that Abraham's servant has to make in order to find Rebekah. And so then we have verses 15 through 49. And in verses 15 through 49, the servant goes and he goes to Haran, which is in northern Mesopotamia between the Euphrates and the Habor River. Nahor, Abraham's brother, has 12 sons. And so one of those sons, his name is Bethuel. And he had fathered a beautiful daughter named Rebekah. And so about the hour when it was cool in the day, Rebekah comes out to draw out water. And so women would normally come out either early morning or late in the afternoon whenever it was cooler to draw water, which is interesting because in John 4, what are we told about the woman at the well that Jesus meets in John 4? When does she draw water? Noon, hottest part of the day. And we later find out, why does she do that? She's a social outcast, right? So, she doesn't hang out with the ladies, right? She's been shamed because she's got 5 husbands and the one she's with isn't her husband. So we can see, even through 2,000 years, this custom of women going out and drawing water during the cool of the day is the same. Not all traditions are bad, right? Sometimes people are like, I'm not doing that because that's the way my dad used to do it. Traditions are bad. Not all. Some traditions are good, right? Drawing water out of the cool of the day is not a bad tradition to have. But he goes and he finds Rebekah. She's very attractive. And he's got some camels. He's got 10 camels. Now we read this passage here and we don't think of anything. Camels did not become commonplace in the Middle East until 1200 BC. This takes place in 2000 BC. That's 800 years before camels become commonplace in the Middle East. 800 years is a long time. I mean, we're talking about the 1200s, going back 800 years from our own time frame. In fact, for many years, critics would say the Bible is not true. You can't trust the Bible because it says that Abraham had camels and nobody had camels in the ancient Near East at 2000 BC. Nobody. Well, now, through archaeological evidence, we realize that some people did have camels in Palestine in 2000 BC, but it was very few, like less than a handful, mostly kings and Abraham. And Abraham just doesn't have one camel, he's got 10. And so Abraham sends this envoy back to his hometown, if you will, and he's trying to show his relatives and the people back home that he left home, God promised that he was going to bless him, and God's blessed him. Because Abraham's got wealth like an ancient king, because he's trusted in God. And so he goes, he's got these 10 camels, and a camel was something that had been extremely, extremely rare in the ancient world. And so just to make sure you're awake, what is the country today that has the most camels in the world? You got one for Egypt. Anybody else? Nobody? I'm not expecting you to know it offhand, but somebody give me at least 1 or 2 more guesses. Egypt? Africa? Which part, which country in Africa? Chad. Okay. Is it hot in Chad? No.
The U.S.
The U.S.? Afghanistan? Saudi Arabia? Somalia? They did in 1990. Did you Google it back there? Yeah. They used to have the most. I could see his eyes go down. I knew. Australia. Yeah, they actually have to import camels from Australia to the Middle East today. And so, pretty crazy when you think about it. Yes, John.
I digress, but can you explain this practice of placing one's hand over the thigh when they make the cross?
No, I can't. No, I cannot. So, yes, I can, all right? Disclaimer, and I feel like we say this more than we probably should in this class. This is the adult class. We discuss adult things in this class, okay? And so if you're not an adult, you should be at one of the children's classes, okay? If you're a parent and your child's in here, that's not my fault, okay? All right. Okay. Anybody know what a testimony is? A testimony? What is a testimony? A covenant, right? What is a testament? Okay, a will, right? From Hebrews chapter 9, right? Talks about a will, a death taking place. Anybody know a part of the male anatomy that rhymes or that sounds a lot like testimony or testament? Anybody? Okay. All right.
Don't get it.
Well, Chad. Well, look at this picture, Donsley. And so the word that's translated thigh is, there was a common practice in the ancient world that even took place even in the ancient world with like Rome, even 2,000 years ago, where the male anatomy around the thigh, right, was seen as like the most sensitive part of the body, and it was also seen to contain the future generations, right? And so it was commonplace for someone, whenever they gave a testament or an oath, to put their hand in that area. Now, whether or not they touched the area or if it was just below the area as a symbol, it's really here nor there, and you'll have people that argue either way. But that's what it's talking about under his thigh, putting their hand under their thigh. It was seen as an oath, like, upon my children, like, you make this promise. And so, yeah. I was hoping nobody would, John, but yeah. He already knew that. Yeah, he's just trying to see if we've talked about it. Yeah. And so, yeah, handshaking seems to be a lot better way. Or putting your hand on the Bible, right? And so, yeah. And so, which tonight? And so the servant goes there and he sees that he's gone back and he says, Lord, if I found favor in your sight, please help me find a woman for my master Abraham. And he says, when this lady comes out and I ask her to give me a drink, let her say yes, and then she'll feed my camels also. Now, a camel that's been on a journey can drink 25 gallons. He's got 10. That's 250 gallons. The average pot in the ancient world was 3 gallons. A gallon of water is 8.8 pounds, right? And so when a lady is trying to bring up a 3-gallon jar of water, that's roughly about 25 pounds, right? For her to be able to feed and water his horses, she's got to pull that 25-pound bucket up 80 to 100 times. So highly unlikely, very likely that they would have been hospitable and a woman would have offered him a drink. Highly unlikely that a woman would have offered to feed his camels for 2 hours, which is about how long it would have taken. So he says, Lord, let her say not only you, but also your camels, because this is something that is going to be exceptional, outside the norm, right? It's going to be a sign. And so Rebecca comes out, she does that. He finds out that she's actually a kin of Abraham, who he's looking for. The servant rejoices because he knows God's hand is in it. Not only has she done this thing, but she also happens to be from the right family. And so he gives her a nose ring, a gold nose ring, and he also gives her some bracelets that are worth 10 shekels of gold. Now, how many shekels did you get paid a year back in the day? 10 silver shekels. These are gold shekels, which are worth even more. And so, ladies, think about this. This guy comes into Chapel Hill, and you're not married, right? Let's start by that way, okay? You're not married. You're an eligible bachelorette, and he comes in on a fleet of 10 Lamborghinis, right? You've heard about Lamborghinis, but you've never seen one in person, right? He comes in with 10 Lamborghinis, and he gives you some bracelets that are worth about $50,000 a piece, right? And says, I'm just a humble servant, but my master back home is super rich. He needs a wife, right? I don't know about you, right? But a lot of people be a little tempted right there to say, we got a picture? Like, what's he look like? What's his sign? Do we match? I'm just playing. But this is what happens in the ancient world. And so he says, can I go back to your father's house and stay? She says, yes. She runs back, tells her dad what's taking place. The monetary gifts highlights his authenticity. He's not some charlatan. He's not some vagabond. This dude's either got some serious money or he works for somebody that's got some serious cash just to throw this stuff around. And so it also kind of gets the ball rolling with her menfolk and the fact that he wants to get her back to Isaac to get her married. But it also highlights God's blessings, because where did all this money come from when Abraham left back home? It came from God, right? I mean, Abraham is just a nomad. I mean, he leaves his family with just his wife and the possessions he has. And now he's coming back all these years later, and, brother's done pretty good for himself. And so then we see in verses 50 through 60 that the family agrees for her to marry Isaac. If you will, let's read verses 50 through 60 of Genesis chapter 24. Then Laban and Bethuel answered and said, "This thing has come from the Lord. We cannot speak to you good or bad. Behold, Rebekah is before you. Take her and go, and let her be the wife of your master's son, as the Lord has spoken." All right, and let's just stop there. Okay, so the men agreed to give her away. Did Rebekah have a say in the situation? No. Welcome to the ancient world, right? And so Laban and Bethuel say, "You know what? Yeah, go ahead." And we're going to read for time's sake the rest of this passage. But we see the servant is going to give lots of gifts to Rebekah, to Laban, and to Bethuel. And so they say, "Let's wait 10 days, right? Before you go back to your master, let's just wait 10 days." Now this is interesting because Laban is the one who brings this up. Does Laban ever try this any other time with somebody else? Yeah. You see, things don't change very much for Laban, right? And so he tries to get this, he's already given us a whole bunch of stuff. If he stays 10 more days, maybe he'll give us some more stuff. I don't know. And so it seems like Laban's pretty greedy here, because we're going to see in the next generation, when he has a daughter named Rachel, that Jacob's going to come and he's going to say, "Well, if you work 7 years for my daughter, I'll give it to you." And then what does Laban do? Tricks him, right? And he makes him work 7 more years. So he doesn't get the servant to stay 10 days, but he gets Jacob to stay for 14 years working for Rachel's hand. And one of the sweetest passages in the Bible, since we're so close to Valentine's Day, is when it said that those 14 years seemed like only a matter of days because Jacob loved Rachel, right? So that's pretty nice little. You could men next year for Valentine's Day. Right, Hunter, you listen to this? You could say, like, these last 5 years, or like these last 50 years for some of you couples have seemed like only a matter of days because I love you so much, right? Would that be nice, ladies? Wouldn't it? So, yeah, you're welcome, right? And so he says, "No, we need to get back and we need to go." And so Laban and her dad, Bethuel, turn to her and say, "Well, Rebekah, do you want to stay or you want to go?" And Rebekah says, "No, I'm ready to go." And so they leave. He gives them more expensive gifts. She takes her nurse with her. A nurse would have been seen to be a more expensive form of a slave. And we're told in Genesis 35 that her name is Deborah. And so many people know about the judge named Deborah from the book of Judges, but also Rebekah's nurse is named Deborah. And so she goes along with her. And so they set out for this 500-mile trek to go back and to find Isaac, the man she's going to marry, the man she's never seen. Also, the nurse would have gone with them in the ancient world also to ensure Rebekah's purity on the trip with the men back to Abraham's base camp. And so then we get to Rebekah and Isaac in verses 61 through 67. Small tidbit, my sister's name is Rebekah. And so my parents had a boy and girl named Rebekah and Isaac. So, they like Bible names. So. Anyways, verses 61 through 67. 61 through 67. And then Rebekah and her young women arose and rode on the camels and followed the men. And the servant took Rebekah and went his way. Now Isaac had returned from Beer Laharoi and was dwelling there in the Negeb. And Isaac went out to meditate in the field toward evening. And he lifted up his eyes and saw, and behold, there were camels coming. And Rebekah lifted up her eyes, and when she saw Isaac, she dismounted from her camel, and she said to the servant, "Who is that man walking in the field to meet us?" And the servant said, "It is my master." And so she took her veil, and she covered herself. And the servant told Isaac all the things that he had done. And then Isaac brought her into the tent of Sarah's mother, and took Rebekah, and she became his wife, and he loved her. So Isaac was comforted after his mother's death. And so here we see here that on the way back, they're traveling there, and it says here that Isaac is in the field and he's meditating. It appears this was a common thing that Isaac did. The problem is, this is the only time this word is ever used in the Bible, that Isaac was meditating. And so there are different suggestions as to exactly what he was doing. Was he praying? Was this a nightly prayer that he would often do? Was he mourning because of the connection that we have with Sarah's death in the previous chapter, but also the fact that after he's married, he's comforted. Most people kind of lean toward this idea of being this a time of reflection. Isaac is sad that his mom has passed away, a time of mourning. Seems contextually probably most likely what's taking place. Rebekah gets off the camel when she realizes that Isaac is near, and she puts her veil on her face. Now, in the ancient world, customs between veils would change. They would change based upon time and also based upon location. In some cultures, like the culture of Abraham's, a married woman would not wear a veil, but a woman would wear a veil on her wedding day. It was seen as kind of like this passing, if you will. Now, it's kind of interesting because up until recent times in our own culture, it was pretty common for women to wear veils when they're married. In fact, raise your hand if you wore a veil when you were married. Right? Few of you, right? Why? It's tradition, right? And so why does Rebekah wear a veil? Tradition, right? And so in some cultures it was different, like in the old Assyrian cultures around Babylon. Married women had to wear veils, but unmarried women didn't. And so it just changed from place to place throughout the ancient world. But this indicates a marriage, okay? In Abraham's time in the ancient Near East, when a woman covered her face with a veil, it was often for the marriage ceremony, which is interesting because how does Jacob get tricked into marrying Leah instead of Rachel? She wears a veil, right? So you can't tell one sister from the other because she's got a veil on, all right? And so they marry. It says here that Isaac loved Rebekah. The same thing is mentioned about Abraham's love for Sarah and also Jacob's love for Rachel, which is good because in the ancient world, love oftentimes, marriage was not based upon love. But here we see with the patriarchs, that is indeed the case. And so he took her to Sarah's tent, which was a signification that she is now the mistress of the family. Like she's the head female in the Abraham camp, if you will. And then in the next chapter, Abraham's going to remarry, and those will take their positions of power also. A question so far on Genesis 23 or 24? No? You got them all out with John's, didn't you? Right? That was, yeah. All right. Any comments? Anything that you saw in the text that we didn't get to talk about for time's sake that you thought was interesting?
It's odd that there weren't very many girls born that time. Seems like from the names, it sounds like
Yeah, it does. And the fact that oftentimes the daughters just weren't mentioned, right? In fact, Job is one of the only ones where the daughters, the names. I think Job is one of the few times where the daughters' names are given in the book of Job, and it seems like they were a little chauvinistic back then, Miss Linda. And I'm glad we've come a long way since then, right? So, but yeah, sons were seen as to be, be special, if you will, right?
Abraham is very interesting in that he talked about Moses' right and trying to teach the children that this is their right. Abraham, every time, tells people, keep your money. Because I don't want anybody to say, I made Abraham rich.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Only God was going to make you rich. How many times if we would just take that concept and apply it to ourselves, money was not an issue for Abraham.
Mm-hmm.
It's not that he didn't worry about money. He just trusted so much in God that he's like, God, if I'm going to be rich, it's going to be because of God. It's not because some man gave me money and did rich for that.
Absolutely. And if you couldn't hear Brother Faust, he said that Abraham always trusted in God when it comes to monetary issues. Like in Genesis chapter, I think it's 15, around there, when Abraham saves the kings, right, who've been taken by the four kings. They try to repay him, and he says, I've already made a promise with God. I'm not going to benefit monetarily from this fight. We see here that he doesn't want anything discount because he trusts in God. Jesus says something in the Sermon on the Mount, right? Pretty similar. Seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and these things will be added to you. And so just like Abraham, if we would have a focus on God's going to provide for us, we'd probably feel a lot more fulfilled and a lot less anxious about life if we would kind of adopt that same mentality that Abraham had. And so, great point, comment. Anyone else? two of the takeaways that I see here that came to my mind is wanting the spiritual best. And so when it came time for Abraham to seek a wife for his son, he wasn't worried about making alliances in the land of Canaan because, as you already mentioned, he was trusting God. God said, I'm going to give you this land. He didn't need to marry Isaac off to the most powerful king in the region. He was more concerned about the spiritual state of his son. As parents, that's what we should be doing, right? And I think the takeaway 2 kind of goes with takeaway 1. Like, we should want the spiritual best for our kids in every avenue. One of the things I'm afraid of sometimes, at least in my own experience and what I see with parents and their children, is we don't emphasize the importance of a spiritual Christian marriage with our kids. We should be teaching our kids from the time they are barely able to understand sentences, the importance of living a spiritual life, but also when they get older, looking for a spiritual spouse, trying to find a spouse that's going to honor God, and going ahead and instilling, call it brainwashing, call it whatever you want, but go ahead and instilling the principles and the ideas that when you grow up, if you're living your life and your number one goal is to serve God, then you ought to find a mate of the opposite sex who wants to serve God. Because if you find someone who's physically attractive but has no desire to serve God whatsoever, you should not find that attractive as a Christian. Because that doesn't align with your worldview. That doesn't align with how you want to raise your children or live your life. And not only teach our kids to look for Mr. and Mrs. Right, but to be Mr. and Mrs. Right. So that when you can be that individual for somebody else, be that rock, that foundation in that marriage. And so many times I'm afraid we just, they're kids, they can figure out themselves, kids need to be instructed from the time they're young what to look for in a mate, and that is someone who's going to help be a spiritual asset to them in their life. Because I can think of many people, even in this congregation, who were brought to the Lord because of their spouse. People who married individuals weren't Christians. But I can name dozens of individuals who were Christians who got astray by their spouses. So, we need to teach our kids to look for individuals who are spiritually mature and who can help them get to heaven. Any questions or takeaways before we pray? No? All right. Let's go ahead and let's pray. Thank you so much for your attendance and your comments and your questions. Except John. Okay. Dear Heavenly Father, we're so thankful for this day and for all the many blessings you've given us. We're so thankful for men like Abraham and Isaac who are going to devote their life in your service. And dear Heavenly Father, we hope and pray that each and every one of us will follow their example and devote our lives to living faithfully to you, putting our trust and hope not in ourselves, not in our own wisdom, but putting our faith and our trust in you and your ability to deliver us from man or from Satan. Dear Heavenly Father, please help us to look for individuals that we can align ourselves with who are spiritually minded, whether it be friends, whether it be potential relationships for those who are unmarried. But dear Heavenly Father, please give us also the zeal and the desire to find people who are away from you, but who have a zeal to serve you, a zeal to know you, and help us to share the gospel with them and bring them in a right relationship with you and a relationship with us as your people. Please watch over us and bless us and help us to be faithful each and every day. In your Son's name we pray. Amen.